to deliver this. And as far as I can tell, all the banks who are supposed to administer this, they weren't ready to do that. They didn't know how to do it. And we're basically paying them to service it, which I guess, I mean, there's no other apparatus to do this. But let's move to the third tranche, which is that $400-500 billion that goes to corporate America that essentially is being leveraged by the Fed to make the bailout for corporations closer to $4 trillion. And that, I mean, it seems to have like no problem. We've already built those pipes that we can get that money to them immediately. And it sort of feels like, and this seems to be the criticism of the stimulus to the extent that I can figure it out, is that, like you say, we're under a freeze. And how do we freeze the economy? And I guess I was using the metaphor of like, we're all under a yellow flag, except for those people who are in entities that are going to get the money through the Fed and through that corporate bailout. They're allowed to go at full speed around the racetrack, whereas the rest of us, we're in a yellow flag situation. And this is going to increase wealth disparity, income disparity, and create more concentrated power by corporations.
Yeah, I think that's all right. There's two elements to it. One is a $50 billion straight up bailout fund, which is airlines, Boeing, national security companies, which in our corporate warfare state could be literally any corporation. But there's $50 billion, which is going to have people trying to observe it. And many of them are quite talented, and I wish them luck. But that is money that is basically off to corporate America and the strictest way of avoiding a bankruptcy court. Then there's $450 billion, which will be levered up by the Federal Reserve, which will do a couple different things. Most notably, it will make loans to large corporations as the credit markets freeze up. The Fed is really the only entity competently tasked administratively, especially at the federal level, to do this kind of work of quickly reacting to macroeconomic crises. But it is not set up to, say, send people checks. You could easily imagine that everyone could have a checking account at the Federal Reserve, or a little credit card that's their account at the Federal Reserve that's maybe run through postal banks, and the Fed could press a button and give everyone $1,200 within seconds. That is not what we have. As you said, it's going to take 10 weeks to hopefully send everyone a check if they can find them. So the disparity of these two different kinds of reactions is really stark and really shoddy, and speaks to how quickly we can help large corporations and how limited and weak our response is to to everyday people and smaller businesses.
Okay, so and then we're seeing let's do it this way: grade that stimulus based upon concept. And then, execution, I think we can give another grade. But in terms of like conceiving of it, where would you put that stimulus? How would you grade that, the phase 3?
C minus, C. Here's the problem is that, and there's maybe a glass half full way of understanding, is that instead of finding the solution and adequately levering to it, it's a bunch of small stopgap measures that may hopefully add up to do something. So instead of giving everyone an actual basic income, you get one check. It doesn't renew, even though that's insane, because if there's a Democratic president next year and a Republican Senate, they will absolutely not renew it, even if unemployment is 10 or 15 or 20%. And this goes to the small business and medium-sized business loan issue with the banks. Instead of actually just sitting down and saying, we are going to backstop payrolls, it's going to cost us much money, but we think it's worth it to keep our small and medium-sized business ecosystem intact. Instead, they kind of created this loan program, which might turn into a grant. And then halfway through writing the legislation, they're like, oh, wait, but maybe it's actually going to help preserve payroll, so it's a little bit more generous. And then they pass it, and now it's clear it's the mechanism by which we're going to try to backstop it. And now they are rapidly scrambling to fix the program after the fact, instead of just straight up coming out in front and saying, we have this kind of crisis that requires this kind of response from our government. There's just no leadership to say those kinds of things, and no one willing to make those kinds of bold demands. So instead, you get a lot of like third measures, which maybe if they all add up well, can sort of constitute a solution, but it's not a real solution executed well.
And the execution similarly poorly graded. So what what do you think that give me your assessment of how the Democrats played this? Because I mean I think it's quite clear too that phase 4, there's two separate things that are going on here. One is like, what are we going to do for in terms of an economic response? But then there's also sort of like, what are we going to do in terms of, well, there seems to be two other areas for me where there's other things that should be included in this, and that maybe Democrats can leverage this, which is one, how do we deal with goods and services? I don't know if this is going to be a big deal, but Tyson's, one pork processing plant closes. I mean, I'm not a fan of Tyson's or pork processing plants, but I imagine we could also have a problem with produce. Like, people are going to get sick. We're starting to see people get sick at at supermarkets. Maybe there'll be people who will run to come and work at those supermarkets, or maybe they won't. Maybe there'll be people who will come to pick in the fields. Maybe they won't. But we could have like a goods and services issue. And then we also have a civil sort of a citizenry issue, like in terms of voting and other functions, where Democrats could maybe leverage stuff and put stuff like that in. Like, if you want these things, you got to give us these things. But what's your sense of what Democrats should push for in a phase 4? Specifically economic, but then maybe you can talk about those other issues if you have some ideas.
Sure. So I'm not a Hill reporter, so I don't know the insides of who made what political decisions and who should get credit or blame. But I will note two things. One is that, like, Mitch McConnell is a tough operator and Trump is a very chaotic figure. The Democrats in the Senate fought for higher unemployment insurance. They fought for a bunch of other things. And, we can judge how much they got or what they got. What stands out to me is the House, even though it was probably clear they were going to vote on whatever the Senate was able to pass, did not provide a good alternative mechanism that was a clear messaging response. And as such, it leaves us very adrift on what happens next. Speaker Pelosi and all the other Democrats we don't point to the House bill as having, the public option or the Medicare for all or the Green New Deal or what, like those may be not appropriate here, but like there's no, that's the thing that the Dems should fight for, and the Dems are fighting for.
Right. They're not offering any type of alternative to which to judge whether this was effective or not. Exactly.
The leadership in the House got into a big fight about whether or not the check should be universal. And then, they quickly scrambled after they passed one thing and kind of had a laundry list bill, which had a lot of priorities in it, but wasn't an actual messaging bill or not even just messaging in a cheap way, but an actual, here is what the alternative is. So now as we go, and the government runs really slowly and this crisis is evolving very fast, but the phase 3 things are in some ways no-brainers. In a recession, you increase unemployment insurance, you backstop the states, you get money to people, you try to keep employment going. This crisis is so crazy that it's hard to do that fast and at the scale we're talking about. But the next step things that are the things okay, how do we protect essential workers who are facing incredibly precarious working situations with no legal protections or unions? Do we do a unionization bill? Do we do some sort of, some sort of new social security? I don't even know, because that hasn't been articulated. I mean, I have ideas, but there's no thing that the Democrats have put forward. Same thing with healthcare. Millions of people are going to lose their healthcare. We just had this huge fight about how people like their healthcare because they get to keep it from their employer, but now millions of people will not get
sometimes
that.
they get to keep it. Sometimes
Medicare
they
for all, is that TRICARE, is that Medicaid? The Dems have not messaged this and put forward an alternative. And so in the election, what's going to happen with the election? What is the actual thing Democrats want as a safeguard for the election? individual senators like Senator Warren and Senator Sanders are putting forward messages, but it's not like the leadership is doing it in such a way that it provides the real alternative.
What would you put in phase 4? What would be your top 2 or 3 priorities?
I'm not a healthcare expert, but something needs to be done about healthcare that can start transitioning us to Medicaid for all, Medicare for all, however it's going to go. Now we need like the smart thinking about how to start the transition, because I think that it's just the fact that it is a healthcare crisis in addition to a mass unemployment crisis is going to make it doubly worse than, say, the Great Recession. I would like to see a lot more funding to states. We know that austerity in the states, one, really harms the recovery as it did in 2009, 2010. And also the austerity locks itself in. So services and schools that are cut or dismembered don't come back in the recovery. So aid to states, I think, is really important. And I think the big thing is getting the stuff to automatically renew, which is a no-brainer to me. But, this recession is not going away. And if the Dems win the presidency in November, like Mitch McConnell, if they still control the Senate, are not going to negotiate with them if unemployment is 10% next year, as they did not in 2011. We remember this. This is living memory of the people who run the Democratic Party.
That was 9 years ago. That was 9 years ago.
Next year is insane.
That was 9 years ago. Nobody remembers that. There's no one possibly. And I just want to explain what you're suggesting so that people understand this. You could fashion the bill in such a way where it is, we're going to benchmark if unemployment is at this level, then this amount of unemployment insurance must be flooded into the system. If it is at another level, a higher or lower level, there's a commensurate amount. Make all of this automatic. So you don't have to go back to Mitch McConnell every time and say, hey, please, people are suffering. And he goes, I don't care. You're a Democratic president. Our job is to get you out of office. We're willing to let people suffer if we think it's going to help our fortunes in the midterms. And so that's basically what we're looking at, right? Is this system where there are benchmarks that automatically, and these are what we mean by automatic stabilizers, where it kicks in based upon the feedback it's getting from the economy.
Absolutely. And the automaticness of it both makes it more effective, but also takes off these political ransom moments that are really destabilizing for our ability to answer these problems. And a lot of thinking had been going into this for the last couple of years. And the fact that none of it was taken up here, I think, is really disappointing. It may have been a very hard ask. I was not involved in the negotiations at all, but the fact that it's not even really broached, and crucially, the fact that the House is not flagging this as the alternative, makes me think that they're going to be outmaneuvered quite significantly.
I mean, the idea that like we had such a recent example of this on some level, and it does feel like who can remember all that stuff that happened? I mean, it really is. It's shocking. But Mike, I really appreciate you coming on and talking to us about this. People can check out more of your work at the Roosevelt Institute. And what is your Twitter still Rorty Bomb?
It's still Rorty Bomb, RORTYBOMB. And you can check me out on Twitter too. That's where I'll link to all my stuff.
That's where I see it all. Mike, thanks so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on.
All right, folks. We're going to do it a little bit different because we've got two basic, another facet of what we were talking about in terms of phase 4 is going to be voting. And we're seeing a perfect example of the crap show. It is unimaginable what is taking place over the past, I guess, I don't know how many hours that is, 72 hours. The long and short of it is that Evers, the governor of Wisconsin, was a little bit late and a little bit timid in pressing the Republican legislature in Wisconsin. Now, there are a couple of things you have to remember. The Democrats got over 50% of the votes in the last election in Wisconsin for state representatives. 50% of the votes across the board. 50, I think it's 52 or 54 or 51. Because of gerrymandering, Republicans won 64% of the seats that make up the state legislature. when there is an attempt to push back and say, hey, this is not the way that democracy works. If you get more than 50% of the votes, you should have at least close to 50% of the elected representatives. We're going to take this to the state Supreme Court. But the state Supreme Court is dominated by conservatives.